our first speaker. But before we do, I thought I would highlight some of the upcoming seminars, both in our department and in the GDPE program or the graduate degree program in ecology. So I'll give you those titles real quick, and then I'll hand it over to Nora. So next week, GDPE is hosting their last Distinguished Ecologist seminar, and that's in the biology building. So you can go to the GDPE website and find out where that's at if you're interested. It's Bio 136. But Chris Funk, who's in the biology department, will be talking about a frog tail about a tailed frog. Why an evolutionary perspective matters for predicting sensitivity to increasing temperatures. So if you're interested in that, head over to the bio building next Wednesday at 4. The week after that, on April 15th, our own Mark Paschke will be talking to us about restoration as reassembly of a plant soil system, emergent properties beyond species lists. And that will be back in here on April 15th at 4 p.m. And then on April 22nd, Seth, who I also saw, I don't know where he's at now, Seth will be talking about bees and the flowers they visit in the Colorado Front Range. So the next 3 weeks, we have some great seminars. So I hope to see you at one or all of those. But I'm especially glad you're here today for Carrie's seminar. So I will now hand it over to Nora to introduce Carrie.
Okay. Thank you, Troy. Well, welcome everyone. Thanks for coming. I have the distinct honor of introducing my PhD advisor, Carrie Havrilla. Carrie has been at CSU for the past 5 years. She currently serves as an assistant professor in the Department of Forestry and Rangeland Stewardship. Before that, she did her PhD work at CU Boulder, which we can forgive you for, go Rams, and then held a postdoc with the USGS in Flagstaff. Whether or not you've gotten a chance to know Carrie over the past 5 years, she can be a somewhat difficult person to pin down, but that's because she's very busy, and she's very busy doing important things. So she could be advising us, her graduate students, in the dryland ecology and management lab. She could be working really hard with some of our collaborators to solve real restoration problems, such as the Ute Mountain Ute Tribe or CSU Extension. She could be teaching undergraduate courses, or she could be parenting her 2 small children. It'd take up a lot of time, I'm sure. Carrie is broadly a plant and soil ecologist with a focus on restoration of dryland systems. Drylands are a challenging place to work, as she will tell you more about very shortly, but Carrie brings a sense of optimism to her work that is absolutely unshakable, as well as a deep love and understanding of the ecology of these places and a collaborative spirit that makes this science work. So without further ado, Carrie.
Really good to be here. Really exciting to get to share with friends and colleagues and folks I haven't had a chance to meet yet. So it's really always fun to give these seminars to groups that are friendly and local, and I love that so much. Felt like I was competing with the Artemis 2 launch today, so I really appreciate you being here despite this like monumental day for science. So thank you so much. And I will say that I considered like 7 different April Fool's jokes to put into this talk, but I didn't put any of them in there because they were all just like too corny. Okay, so there aren't any. I didn't put any in. But today I'm going to be sharing several of our community engaged precision restoration projects from our lab group, the CSU Dryland Ecology and Management Lab. I'm going to talk about co-developing place-based restoration strategies in southwestern Colorado with the Ute Mountain Ute Tribe, testing targeted restoration treatments with a co-produced large-scale research restoration network called RestoreNet, and also exploring some opportunities for future directions that we're really excited about as a lab in the ecovoltaic space. So it's kind of a preview of where we're going. Before I start out, though, I just want to start to say that science is a collaborative process. It doesn't happen alone. And I'm going to be giving a talk today that reflects the really hard work of our lab group and all the folks and more that you see on this, the slide here. So graduate students, undergraduate students, postdocs, and a really large group of collaborators and community members work with us on all of these projects. So while I get the privilege of standing up here and sharing all of this with you, it's definitely not all my work. And a lot of it is really led by other people in our group. I meet with some of them are here today, which is really exciting. But our group in Fort Collins is a group of plant and soil ecologists that are broadly interested in understanding plant soil feedbacks and interactions in drylands in the context of environmental change, and really harnessing this information as ecologists to improve dryland restoration and climate adaptation in these spaces. So I'm going to highlight some really amazing work today from graduate student and student champions, postdoc champions in our lab. And also this work couldn't have been possible without our collaborators in CSU Extension, particularly those on the Western Slope. Emily Lockford and Retta Bruger are really close partners. So although not part of our lab, they're kind of parts of our lab. As well as the many funders and research partners and communities that we work with. So we're going to talk a lot about the collaborative process itself today, instead of just talking about the science that we do, to really highlight that piece of working with partners and communities in the context of restoration. But a lot of them really, supported and co-led this work in collaboration with our group. But together, what our lab does, I like to sort of give a broad overview, and then we're going to hone really specifically in kind of one niche area of what we've been working on. But we work on all sorts of things. So everything from microbial ecology in the soils, biocrust ecology is a huge passion of mine, remote sensing and modeling of those communities, using plant functional traits to design better seed mixes in the context of dryland restoration, and then community engaged collaborative restoration projects to explore these really innovative strategies to move the needle on this really hard to do thing, which is re-recruit plants in dryland ecosystems, which is going to be the focus of today. So a roadmap for today, we're going to talk about drylands and restoration first, just to give a broad overview. A lot of folks in our department focus on larger plants and trees, but we focus on the little ones in dryland ecosystems. So I'm going to make sure we're all on the same page about those systems. The role of community engaged precision restoration, and then these three project realms that I talked about previously, kind of highlighting these like vignettes in dryland restoration research. But together, the point of this talk, I'm going to highlight how precision restoration, and specifically this important role of collaboration, is so important on really improving the process of restoration in drylands in this really rapidly changing world. So to start, what are drylands and why do we care about them? So drylands ecosystems cover over 40% of the Earth's landmass. Their cover has actually expanded in recent decades, approximately 4.3 million acres over the last 3 decades. And now they encompass about 41% of the Earth's surface. So while often these systems are thought of as sort of these like very brown, barren ecosystems that a lot of people think about as sort of degraded already, or like wastelands or non-productive, they're in fact highly diverse and highly dynamic systems that have hardy life and ecology that support the cultures and livelihoods of 2.3 billion people worldwide. So they're innately important. So drylands are beautiful and diverse systems. They include not only deserts, but grasslands, shrublands, woodlands, and tundra ecosystems. And they support in these systems, again, this hardy life, so immense biodiversity, from soil microbial communities specialized to really harsh conditions to higher trophic levels, plants, animals, and the like. However, the immense biodiversity and societal importance of these systems is threatened by land degradation, and an estimated 40%, so 40% seems to be key here, but 40% of drylands are currently degraded, and this figure is supposed to increase in coming decades. This degradation often results from a lot of different drivers, but they can include things like resource extraction, land use changes, exurban development, solar development, which we'll talk a little bit about today, overgrazing, and aridification associated with global anthropogenic climate change. This is in turn associated with declines in native plant biodiversity and productivity, decreased soil health and carbon sequestration, and decreased sustainability of habitat and forage for a lot of different wildlife species, as well as different livestock species that are important for human livelihoods and pollinators. So we have a really grand sort of problem here where we see, because of degradation, these systems are highly adapted to harsh conditions, but because they're already adapted to such harsh conditions, it's very easy to tip them over ecological turning points and for them to become degraded. And similarly, it's hard to move the needle back to repairing ecosystem function on human timescales once it's degraded.
Mm-hmm.
So active restoration interventions are often needed in these systems. Not sure how to get rid of all the stuff going on up there.
Do you want me to do that real quick?
I don't know.
Yeah, like
One more. Katie, how do I get rid of that one? Sorry, didn't know that was sitting up there so long. But yeah, so often we need active restoration interventions in these systems to address these really grand challenges. Looks like it's also sort of like pushed off the side there, but we're going to keep going. Yet our conventional approaches, often we use seed-based restoration in these systems. So we broadcast seed or try to address propagule limitations by seeding native plants in these systems, but those conventional approaches often have really limited success, resulting in less than 10% species recruitment in dryland ecosystems. Again, because it's really hot and dry, and we'll talk about that in a second. But so seed-based restoration, adding seed, trying to repair ecosystem functioning and ecological functioning through adding back native seed propagules and establishing plants is often unsuccessful because of a variety of interacting barriers. So we have things like abiotic barriers of nitrogen, phosphorus dynamics limitations, and particularly the main driver of limitation to dryland restoration and seedling recruitment is water availability. So these are dry systems, and precipitation is becoming more variable and more scarce with climate change. Also, there are a lot of other layered barriers, including microbial limitation in degraded soils, invasive plants, and also herbivory, and also the interaction of all these factors with time. So we have this really large sort of cocktail of issues in dryland ecosystems that are really need to be addressed rather than just adding seed onto these systems. So although the US Bureau of Land Management reports tens of millions of dollars are spent on seed-based restoration in the Western United States annually, they have relatively low success, and we have to adopt innovative strategies to improve these outcomes. So often we're looking at additional restoration treatments and interventions, and trying to match which ones we choose to these interacting factors is really important. So I like to adopt what is called precision restoration frameworks. So the precision restoration is basically identifying site-specific critical barriers to restoration success, and then understanding the spatial and temporal variability of those, and aligning restoration strategies accordingly to address those very specific ecological barriers. So this was coined by Stella Copeland at the USGS in 2021, but it's a really helpful framework when you're thinking about doing dryland restoration. And I would argue that merging it with really involving local communities is absolutely key to this process, because it's really hard often as a land manager, especially if or an ecologist, when you're tackling large problems in dryland systems or in any system, to really know what's going on the ground, like local community members and land management practitioners do. So merging these frameworks, combining our ecological knowledge of biotic and abiotic barriers through precision restoration with these local communities and their knowledge is really key. So in addition to this precision restoration framework, my group also, I have a small extension component of my position. So I work a lot with CSU Extension, but really even if I didn't, I would be doing a lot of work with local communities and a lot of different land management practitioners on the ground. I often adopt, this is, if you haven't seen this before, this is the CSU Continuum for Engaged Scholarship that I'm not sure why that one in the middle is there, but all to say, it's basically a continuum that shows that research and creative activity can really vary in how engaged local communities are in this process. So often research sort of tends to be further to the right of this continuum, where we sort of inform communities about our work and why it might be important to them, or perhaps we consult them in the research process. But I would argue that a lot, especially in natural resource management and restoration, we really have to be moving further to the, sorry, I'm slightly dyslexic, to the right-hand side of this continuum towards true engagement, collaboration, and research co-production, not only to make the science itself better, but so that when we find important findings, that the communities we work with are more likely to adopt them and actually use that information. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that process today. I'm going to share about our work and our co-produced dryland restoration research with a variety of partners and communities, and sort of explore this question of how we can use community-engaged precision restoration to restore degraded drylands. And like I mentioned before, I'm going to talk about these sort of 3 different research vignettes. They kind of vary in length from very long at the start to very short at the end. But I'm going to talk through this. I'm going to talk about this process of outcomes and collaboration with precision-based restoration with the Ute Mount Ute tribe in southwestern Colorado, a regional collaborative network with RestoreNet across the Southwest, and then kind of talk about messages of hope and future directions in a really cool new research space, which is ecovoltaics. So, let's see here. First up, I want to introduce for this first project, this region. Some of you may have visited this region of the state, maybe perhaps you haven't, but the Ute Mount Ute Reservation is a sovereign nation and tribal territory that's located in the Four Corners region. So orienting ourselves This is Colorado, and in the southwesternmost corner of Colorado is the Ute Mount Ute Reservation. So also parts of it span into northwestern New Mexico and southeastern Utah. And it's home to the Ute Nation, so a population of approximately 2,100 tribal members. And if you visited this part of the state, you know it's incredibly dry. So resources are limited, and it's a very dry region. Mean annual precipitation, it's highly variable, but around the capital city of Toyah, it's about 350 millimeters per year. But they are increasingly experiencing episodic drought and long periods of dry conditions, which are exacerbating long-term degradation experienced in these lands. So many of the lands in the tribe's 150,000 acre tribal park have experienced land degradation and is associated with, again, climate change, drought, and also overgrazing and long-term exposure to feral horse population that's been very difficult for the tribe to manage. So this is decreased forage availability and soil health. We can see a lot of legacies of land degradation in this photo. And really their long-term agricultural sustainability and resilience to climate change. So this is a key concern that's outlined by the tribe's recent Ute Mount Ute Tribe's Climate Action Plan that was published in 2020 and is really a live document that is constantly added to. But the way that I connect this narrative is that in 2021, right when I was getting started in January of 2021 as a new faculty member here in Colorado at CSU, the then chairman of the Ute Mount Ute Tribe, Manuel Hart, reached out to me and a couple of my partners in extension and really articulated a lot of these challenges that the tribe was experiencing with land degradation and resilience, and particularly seed-based restoration. The tribe was using seed-based restoration approaches, putting valuable resources into those approaches, but to really no avail. So the chairman reached out, and the way that he articulated it to us was that we need more groceries for the cattle. We need more plants on the land. We need more high quality forage so that we can support the livelihoods of the people who live here, as well as the livestock and animals that live here. So that's really like the underpinning key concern of a lot of the work that we've done. And importantly, through this collaborative process, it's really important to know that in working with the tribe and supporting the tribe's sovereignty and sort of capacity in this space, that our group was invited to work with the tribe, and have really been trying to support the tribe and accompany them through this process of learning about how best to do dryland restoration. So our key guiding question is, using collaborative restoration science, can we find solutions to really promote success of seed-based restoration on these tribal lands? So I'm going to talk briefly about sort of our relationship building process and collaboration really briefly. It's much deeper than probably the one slide I will show you. Several of our applied research projects with the tribe over the last 5 years, and also how results are being used to support the tribe's decision-making and really build capacity within their future restoration projects. We're really starting here with this idea of collaboration and co-production. So I'm going to make a note that these are notes about a process for being good partners while engaging with one tribe. All tribes are not the same. All tribal communities are different. There are also published papers about how we can be better partners with tribal communities and a lot of different folks. But I'm just going to tell you kind of anecdotally what has worked well for our group and kind of some of what our guiding principles have been with working with the tribe. So the first being that we respect and support the tribe's goals and sovereignty. So again, we were invited in with very specific goals from tribal leadership and their environmental programs office.
She's with CSU Forest and Rangeland.
I heard about this.
Cool. Hi. But anyway, body voices. We're really trying to help them with these very targeted restoration goals and climate adaptation. So we follow the lead of these tribal offices, tribal leadership, and we're constantly checking in about how to be better partners and how we can support the sovereignty of the tribe. We also have data sharing agreements in place and very specific outlines of how we work with the tribe. We acknowledge Indigenous and traditional ecological knowledge. So tribal members and elders have immense knowledge of these lands that have been, their homes and have been worked by folks working landscapes for many, many years. And so knowledge of the lands and the plants, the cultural context and these ecosystems, it extends back generations. So really respecting that and coming at collaborative science through a lens of, I'm probably not the person who knows the most about this land or these places or even these plants. Okay? but showing up and sustaining community engagement and listening. So invited participation and listening sessions have been really key. We constantly check back in with the tribe. We talk to tribal council through a lot of different meetings throughout the year. And whenever possible, we show up in person and have FaceTime with the folks that we're working with. So these are not all, but some of the underlying principles that we sort of have guiding this work. And it is a messy, and all relationships are messy and like dynamic. It's not always perfect. There's a lot of resource limitation. There's a lot of like people coming and going from offices, and we have to rebuild relationships. Recently, there was a tribal election in 2025, and there's entirely new leadership after building relationships with the last, tribal council. So it's a very dynamic process, and it requires a lot of dedication, time, and patience. Okay. But within this in mind, I'm going to talk about some of our work with the tribe through time. So starting off with a single site project of culturally important site that's been used for cultural plant harvest, and it's very important to the tribal members. So historically, this site was a riparian, sort of cottonwood gallery. It was invaded by tamarisk, invasive species of woody plant species along the riparian corridor. And more recently, with a lot of tamarisk removal efforts, has been invaded by knapweed, Russian knapweed. So a lot of changes to the floodplain, connectivity, and incision and upstream diversion. So a lot of changes have befallen this site over time. So at this site, we're dealing with various interacting barriers to restoration success, and even the philosophical way in which we're restoring the system has had a lot of discussion. When we started this process, we visited the site, went out with folks from environmental programs within the tribe, and did collaborative site selection. We discussed this really complex history of the site and what was important to the tribe during the restoration process. So main goals being to respond to the need for climate adaptive restoration on site and to increase native herbaceous plant density were key goals, and to try restoration treatments that address key barriers that were present here. But the idea being to start small, doing restoration at really small scales, to figure out what works and then to scale it up. So to protect the tribe's resources by not proposing that we do something at a big scale until we know that it works at a small scale. Okay. So I'm going to highlight some work that was really led by Emily Swartz, who has recently defended her PhD in the lab, but Emily sort of championed this project through time. But this is a useful framework that we use throughout Emily's dissertation on this project at this culturally important site. This idea from Hobbs et al. In 2009 that often when we are thinking about restoration and thinking about site conditions, we sort of have to adapt restoration strategies to a climate adapted framework. So historically, again, the site that we're talking about was a cottonwood gallery. However, because of changes in the water table and sort of this invasion dynamics that we talked about with tamarisk and then other herbaceous invaders, it's really changed through time. And so often we're dealing with these novel systems that don't really look like historical conditions at all. And often we're sort of in this place where we might actually think about designing restoration treatments that are in more of a hybrid situation that maybe don't match historical site conditions. So the idea being that it's probably not possible to restore the site as a historical cottonwood gallery, but that it might be possible to sort of merge sort of like a hybrid system that also has an herbaceous layer, potentially with more upland plant species was the tribe's goal, that might be able to meet the needs of grazing and also this altered water table. So very complex things, but thinking about what do we actually mean when we say restoration in this climate adaptation framework? So importantly at the site, there were a couple of big biotic barriers to think about when we were planning restoration treatments: cows and horses, really large feral horse population, and also the land was used historically and presently by a few families for cattle grazing. And so we needed to fence it. It was actually fenced under a previous project, but it's important to know that we fenced this experiment when we were doing dryland restoration. Often that's not even possible, which we'll talk about later in the restoration process, but this one was. And then of course we had this important invasive species, so a really high abundance of Russian knapweed. And we treated half of our plots with herbicide, a highly targeted herbicide milestone to deal with Russian knapweed in the system. Layered on though, so we co-designed treatments with the environmental program staff. I'm going to walk through each really briefly, but we selected locally important plant species that were native to the region, but that were not necessarily native to that site historically as a cottonwood gallery. So more like upland species, and we prioritized species of importance to the tribe. But we layered that with several other restoration treatments that really tackled the specific ecological barriers that limit seedling success in this area. So seeding and seedling planting had been tried in this site previously, but it was relatively unsuccessful. So we layered this with different treatments, one being media lunas. So these are rock structures that are basically water breaks that you can install on the soil surface. These are rooted in indigenous knowledge systems. And the idea is that they sort of slow water runoff off the site, and it should pool, often potentially a little bit more around these rock structures. So this is, again, rooted in indigenous knowledge systems, but more recently popularized by restoration ecologists in the Southwest. We also tried coarse woody debris. So we were trying to do like locally adapted treatments that harnessed readily available materials on site. And due to tamarask removal projects and also cultural harvests, there was a lot of really coarse woody debris on the site. So we raked this into piles in an effort for that coarse woody debris to be used to hopefully retain soil moisture to allow, like, when there is a pulse precipitation event, sometimes mulching or coarse woody debris can be used to retain more soil moisture at the soil surface. We also tested what are known as seed pellets. We're going to talk a lot about these today, but seed pellets are basically also known as seed balls. They address moisture retention, also barriers like biotic granivory and desiccation. So they're amalgamations, combinations of soil, clay, and other amendments, and they basically protect seedlings until the right environmental conditions arrive so that they sort of melt, and then those seeds can germinate, hopefully, when there's a pulse of precipitation. There's been a lot of excitement and energy around seed balls, like we'll talk about today, though. There wasn't very much science to back up whether they actually worked or not, so we advised the tribe to make sure that we were trying it at small scales first before deploying at scale. So we test all of these treatments in tandem with native seeding. We also had controls where we didn't do anything to sort of test for that potential for passive restoration, and also did broadcast seeding, which we can always, across these experiments, sort of think of as business feasible restoration. Crossed with herbicide, no herbicide, and seed pellets, media lunas, or coarse woody debris. So what did we find? We found overall that, so first, herbicide, unsurprisingly, so it might seem like very, like, of course, use herbicide, but actually the tribe was very on the fence about whether they wanted to use herbicide or not for weed control at this site. So we specifically tested herbicide, but unsurprisingly to us, the herbicide effectively reduced Russian knapweed as a targeted herbicide used in this context. So that was great. On the flip side, though, we saw this dramatic secondary invasion by other weed species in the area. So more dramatic than I think any of us could have ever predicted, which is going to be an underpinning of how complicated and difficult it is to restore ecosystems in these drylands that have a lot of really competitive weeds that can deal better sometimes with these intense abiotic and biotic barriers than native species can. We saw this massive secondary invasion, which was a huge underpinning of limited success in this project. So introduction to the plot here. So we're just looking at 2 monitoring events, relatively short-term experiment here. We started monitoring in May of 2023. We monitored in the spring and fall of each year in 2023 and 2024. So relatively short-term effects we're going to show you today, but seeded species density on the y-axis across these different treatments. So what to highlight? So first off, I want to say that we found that control, doing nothing, passive restoration just didn't result in anything coming up, which is what we expected. This was also confirmed by seed bank assays that Emily did. And then importantly, pretty up until here, especially, this is kind of an outlier, but just broadcast seeding did very little as well, and especially across the first 3 monitoring events. This outlier in September of 2024 is mostly because there was a huge pulse of precipitation during that time, and we don't actually know if those species persisted, those seedlings persisted or not. But what I want to highlight, and we're actually in the process of kind of going back through the data analysis here and adopting a Bayesian approach. So I'm not going to show you stats, but I anecdotally want to show you from Emily's dissertation that what was cool is that we anecdotally did see that media lunas always resulted in at least some plant recruitment across our plots, which was really promising in this area that was pretty desolate and difficult to restore in the context of weed invasion. And then similarly, we found that porosity debris also, especially in that second year, resulted in seedling recruitment of our desirable plant species. So although very limited success here, we found some like really, inspirational things happening here that when we do target water limitation and other like microsite challenges to seedling recruitment, we can overcome some of those barriers. And these are also very, very low cost, low tech strategies. So we found some promise in this that the tribe's really interested in. And then I will say that some of the species that also emerged that we kind of consistently saw across the plots were blue flax and winter fat. And these are important species in this restoration, particularly winter fat is a really high quality forage for a lot of the wildlife and cattle species. So we found this really promising, and we're still kind of like puzzling through some of these dynamics. That weed invasion made this really tough, but we saw some promise in these precision-based restoration strategies for the tribe, and none of these are really expensive or hard to do things. So the tribe's pretty excited about that. Second, I'm gonna, with that first project with the tribe, I wanted to note that, there was pretty limited success of these seeded species. Still, there was a lot of excitement about seed balls, even though we didn't see that there was a lot of success at this culturally important site. So what we did, kind of in tandem and a little bit after this first project, is we also wanted to really puzzle through like what makes these seed pellets tick, and can we improve the technology of how we make those, given that we're seeing pretty low success in the field. So seed pellets or seed balls, again, they're these clay, seed, and other optional amendments to encase the seeds. They're meant to protect seeds until desirable conditions arise in these really like temporally and heterogeneous ecosystems. So they have a lot of broad claims, but our understanding of the best practices for actually how to make them was really limited and kind of remains to be pretty limited. So I wanted to highlight that this is actually from another experiment I'm going to highlight, but we put out seed balls in some of our other research plots with the Ute tribe and some of the upland habitats back in 2023. And those same seed balls are still on the landscape right now, kind of just sitting there like little golf balls of seed. So it was very clear to us that especially in these conditions, that the way that we were making seed balls was not effective. And we wanted to figure out like how does this actually work, and can we improve some of these strategies? So we conducted a series of greenhouse experiments led by a lot of different students in the lab. We wanted to explore what the best methods for making seed balls were, so creation methods, potential for including amendments to protect seeds when deploying alongside herbicide. And we also wanted to try out adding inoculation treatments or soil microbial additions to some of the seed balls to see if that could boost success. So first we conducted, this was a study led by Ember Bradbury, who just defended her dissertation in the lab, but we were really interested in testing out, so often seed balls are deployed, you sort of like either make them by hand, a lot of like restoration nonprofits do this, make them by hand, and they're sort of like these golf balls, and that's what you saw in the field that was still sitting there today. But we tested that method relative to mechanically made seed balls. And so often people are sort of in the restoration space are ramping up on a lot of more sophisticated methods to make seed balls using like industrial pasta making machines or soap making machines, but not every manager has access to those types of machines. So an alternative to this, to mechanically make seed balls, is actually known as a seed ball bike. This method was coined by Elise Fornish's lab at University of Arizona. But you basically just get like any old bike, you mount it and you put a barrel in the back. You add all of your materials into the back, and then the barrel inside looks something like, oh, it's not gonna play. Darn it, that's so sad. But you can kind of like imagine that this is like swirling around, right? It's kind of noisy, and Ember saying wow in the background, but I'll just like put that out there. But anyways, it twirls and it makes these more heterogeneous seed balls that they're all different slightly sizes, but they come together in little balls as you pedal the bike. So if you've ever been to like the farmer's market in the summer and you like pedal the smoothie bike, same principle, but it's for seed balls. So it's really low tech. It costs like $150 to make the whole thing, and you can mass produce seed balls. So we wanted to test if handmade or mechanically made seed balls were more successful. And we actually found that across the board, these mechanically made seed balls were way more successful in supporting seedling recruitment. And it's probably, like I said, about like that heterogeneity and like the ability to have like different size seed balls that are responding differently to pulses of precipitation. So that was really interesting and really cool. We don't have to make them by hand anymore. Okay, so mechanically made seed pellets increase seeded species establishment relative to broadcast seeding across all these projects that I'm going to show you today. Secondly, kind of inspired by our field study with the tribe at this culturally important site with very high weed pressure. So acknowledging that a lot of the time we are putting out native seed in tandem with soils that have herbicide residual in them. So there's a lot of interest in the restoration ecology space to figure out how do we actually protect seedlings during this process of restoring in landscapes where herbicide is also needed. So there's been a lot of energy around adding activated carbon to seeding applications. So what Emily, supported by Bailey Caldwell, an undergrad in our lab, did was to test making seed balls with and without activated carbon underneath herbicide pressure versus not, to see if we could sort of protect our seeds with activated carbon treatments inside of seed balls. And so what we found, so this is no herbicide on the left, herbicide on the right, and then the proportion of emerged seedlings, because we knew how many seeds were in each ball, for broadcast seeding versus seed pellets. And it's pretty interesting. So first, in the absence of herbicide, seed pellets kind of increased emergence with no clear benefit of adding carbon when it was out of the seed ball or in the seed ball. But with herbicide, so importantly, emergence is really low. So like herbicide's doing its job and it's also taking out some of our native species on average. But so there's no benefit of adding carbon to broadcast seeding, but in a seed pellet, although we still have pretty low emergence, there was a benefit of protection of encasing seeds in seed balls and adding carbon. So this is really cool. This suggests that like if you have to do sort of like this fast-paced application of seed in a recently treated with herbicide sort of ecosystem, that seed pellets with activated carbon could be an option, which the tribe was really excited about. Lastly, I wanted to highlight the results of a cool complementary seed pellet study that we did, led by an undergrad in the lab named Jason Wong. So Jason Wong wanted to test out if adding microbial additions to these seed balls could also be a potential strategy for boosting success. So biocrusts are this really important type of microbial community in drylands, often found to have sort of facilitation effects on native plant recruitment, breaking dormancy barriers, things like this. They modify moisture retention within soils, etc. And so Jason tried out to sort of like look at broadcast seeding relative to seed balls with biocrust inoculum. And really coolly, he found that microbial addition, so using native soil microbes from these biocrust communities, pretty dramatically increased seeded species recruitment out of seed balls. So it's going to be foreshadowing for another project that I'm going to share with you, but found some really cool things about like what can we add to seed balls to make them more effective and what are the best ways to make them. So again, mechanically made seed balls across the board, we're doing a really good job of increasing seedling recruitment. We have these potential mechanisms for increasing herbicide protection to seedlings during this process. And soil microbial additions might be an added way that we can sort of pair some of these amendments with seed ball technology. So together we sort of brought this to the tribe and we're learning about how we can best make seed balls. We're still not sure if this will work in the field because we're doing this in the greenhouse, but we have more knowledge than we had before, and ultimately we need to try out more things. So for the last 5 years, another key part of our collaborative work with the tribe has been work with the RestoreNet project, which I'll kind of turn to in a moment. But it's a network dryland restoration field trial network across the Southwest. If you know me, you've probably talked to me about it before because I've been involved with it for a long time. But to briefly introduce it, so it's led by the U.S. Geological Survey out of the Flagstaff office and the Southwest Biological Science Center. And basically it's a collaboration. I think what makes it really neat is it's small plot research where there are 50 by 50 meter field trial plots on private, federally managed, locally managed land, tribal managed land. And we basically try out different precision restoration strategies in these plots and try to figure out not only what works in one place, but how we can understand how those treatments work across broader ecological gradients. So across aridity gradients or soil texture gradients, et cetera. And so there are currently 27 of these sprinkled across the southwestern US. And it's this really important collaborative process between the local community and the RestoreNet network. So everything is decided sort of like collaboratively with those managers. They help us select the treatments and they do the science with us. They co-interpret the findings. And then we talk about how we can apply that knowledge to the practice of restoration ecology. And importantly, we have 2 of these sites, one of them being with Ute Tribe, one at the too many acronyms. The CSU AES, so the Agricultural Experimental Station down in Dolores. Okay, so that's our lab manages those. So this is what the site for our Ute site that we established in May of 2021 looks like. And we tried a lot of different network-wide different treatments and also some locally selected treatments, including superabsorbent polymer beads and coarse woody debris in this upland restoration site. And coolly, we found that, again, like a low-tech treatment called soil pitting, which resembles Hopi waffle gardens or Zuni waffle gardens that are rooted in indigenous knowledge systems. They target sort of capturing water when there's a pulse precipitation event and increasing access of water to seedlings. So we found that these were one of the more promising treatments at the Ute site. And we actually found that this was really consistent across RestoreNet sites across the network. But even more success was actually found not in any of these precision restoration strategies or treatments at the Ute site, but actually by planting seedlings. So in drylands, there's a lot of work that's being done to sort of understand these different bottlenecks to plant recruitment. And there's been some debate over time about, like, is seeding the way to go, or should we be considering actually planting seedlings, even though it's a lot more labor intensive? And it's been estimated that planting seedlings is about 15 times more financially costly. But what we found in this site and across RestoreNet is actually that there was really pretty high establishment of these species, so really low recruitment in any of our seed-based restoration plots. Like, hard to model it, it was so low, but we found a lot of promise for these planting in restoration islands or seedling plantings. And this is really fueling a lot of our new research directions and collaborations with the tribe they're very interested in testing out, like, hey, with this a little bit, like actually a lot of additional effort, is this actually worth it to increase restoration seedling success? So if we can overcome those initial barriers to seedling recruitment and get a plant on the ground, can it survive? And it seems like the answer might be yes. Okay, so kind of wrapping that together, this body of co-produced dryland restoration research with the tribe has resulted in a great deal of actionable science that we've been working with them on. This idea, I know it seems simple, and something that we know, but it's actually been hugely actionable, that broadcast seeding alone is ineffective. So a lot of what the tribe's been doing is taking its effort and resources away from sort of broadcast or drill seeding across rangelands in these systems and allocating it to thinking more critically about these precision restoration treatments. So figuring out, like, what can we actually do that will work because what we're doing is not working. The idea that perhaps low-cost water retention treatments and strategies like these pits or coarse woody debris might improve seedling success. So even without spending a lot of money, there are options for potentially targeting these abiotic and biotic barriers to improve seeded species success. And then these seed pellets, like, they might be able to aid establishment under the right conditions, but it's probably not something we want to just deploy across the landscape right now without additional inquiry, basically, because it doesn't seem quite worth it at this stage. And then really excitingly, the space of, like, this outplanting success suggests that planting seedlings in certain areas might be a strategy we might adopt. And one of the ideas here being that when you plant those species, if they can establish and set seed, they might actually continuously be seeding the adjacent areas and sort of nucleate across the landscape. But really, this is pretty untested in dryland so far, so it's been shown to be effective in more mesic conditions, but we really need to understand if it's going to work in drylands. So highlighting that need for science and sort of like additional work before really scaling out anything in a resource-limited environment. Importantly, our work together is ongoing. It's not something where we just, like, showed up, built relationships, and we're going to leave. Something that's going to be ongoing through time. And another project that we've been doing with the tribe recently is we had success in getting USDA NEFA funding to really work on grazing management planning and climate resilience planning with the tribe. So we're really excited about this. The project's called Strengthening Extension and Education in Rangeland Systems for Greater Climate Resilience. And it's a lesson to myself to not have such long project titles, because I literally have to write it down when I tell people about it because I don't remember what it stands for. But the tribe is a partner working together to support the tribe's capacity for climate adaptation and really like education and drought planning in the grazing management space, right? I always talk too long when I start talking about this project because I love it so much, and then I leave very little time. So I'm gonna like truncate this next little bit here. But I wanted to like kind of broaden out from like, I alluded to the fact that we worked with the tribe on RestoreNet. I also wanted to mention more about RestoreNet because it's something that we do a lot as a lab. We have these local questions with our local community partners in Southwestern Colorado, but we're also part of this much larger learning network across the Southwest. So the next part of this talk, I'm just going to kind of zoom out a little bit to this broader Southwest and talk about the collaborative process through RestoreNet. Again, the idea is to start small, to test restoration treatments across ecological gradients and find out what works so that we can actually make actionable recommendations to managers through time to conserve effort and resources. So like I alluded to in RestoreNet 1.0, so the first 5 years of RestoreNet across these sites, we learned a lot of things. We learned about what didn't work, we learned about what worked and kind of why in different sites. One of the through lines was really that these soil pits were very successful across a lot of these dryland systems across the Southwest. Again, a low-tech, rooted in Indigenous knowledge treatment. So that was really exciting to us. We recently have been ramping up on what is called, or we refer to internally as RestoreNet 2.0. So again, a part of this collaborative network is listening to the managers we work with. Particularly, this is a project that uses a subset of the research sites across 5 of these areas in partnership with local ranching communities and families on private land. And we listened, and what they were really interested in learning more about was how we can use more biotic-based treatments, soil health treatments, and inoculation paired with livestock grazing to as potential strategies to boost species success. So we know from a lot of science, this is a previous meta-analysis of global literature on dryland soil restoration conducted by Louisa Kimmel in our lab group, that soil restoration improves soil health across global drylands. We do it and often it works, which is great. Sometimes these things happen. Particularly, we found that indicators of biological communities, so mycorrhizal colonization and basal respiration, were the most increased metrics of success across dryland restoration projects, suggesting when we do things like microbial inoculation, we can actually improve outcomes of soil health for microbial communities, which is promising. That paired with Jason's work in our lab about adding microbial inoculum to seed balls really inspired us to be like, hey, maybe there's something to this, and we should be playing around more with soil and microbial inoculation, particularly in drylands where we know biopests are really important. And so in this project, we crossed seedling with abiotic treatments that were found to be successful across several of our RestoreNet sites, pits and seed pellets, crossed with soil inoculation and targeted livestock treatments. So the idea being that often restoration in drylands is done by excluding livestock from the process, which is often needed. But in certain systems, particularly in active working lands, there are a lot of questions about, are there benefits potentially to targeted livestock treatments for like surface roughening, maybe creating small micro pits in the soil surface for moisture dynamics, trampling seeded, things like this. And also our soil inoculation treatment being, can we use sort of harvested soil bulked up in the greenhouse and deployed at scale to improve the microbial conditions in severely degraded soils? So this is a picture of Edward Bradbury in our lab group deploying some of that inoculum in sort of a broadcast treatment. This actually was taken by Katie Stites, very famous Katie Stites in the front row here, at the Canyonlands Research Center, one of our sites. And then this is an example of our targeted livestock treatment. It was very brief, it was only for a few hours, but we distributed forage across the plots so that we could actually have that movement to see if trampling and seeds could be beneficial. And then this is it's not going to play because it's not working on this computer, but this is an example of the movement of those cattle across the plot. But ultimately, we sort of layered these restoration treatments in increasing intensity across the plot, and we wanted to see if doing more of these things actually resulted in greater gains for the producers that we were working with. Importantly, we found that, this is just important context for what you're about to see next. These are our 4 sites that I'm going to show you today over time. And this is data from the US Drought Monitor from 2026. But we kind of unfortunately seeded during like a mega drought, right? So like the backdrop of everything I'm going to show you is that often when you have money to do seeding or to do science in rangelands, you end up having to seed when it's really, really dry, which is hugely problematic and often results in really low species recruitment, which is unfortunately what I'm going to show you. But at the same time, so in the backdrop of severe water limitation, like Restaurant 1.0, soil pits showed promise to retain moisture across our network, which was really cool, particularly in the sites that were the driest and the least dry. They're all pretty dry though. These are the sites that have sort of the pulsiest precipitations. This suggests that when there is a large rainfall event, those pits can actually capture water, retain it a little bit longer, which we've shown with sensor data, and seedlings tend to recruit better in those systems. So it makes sense. When there's water, a water capture treatment actually works. We found pretty limited effects of the livestock treatment on outcomes, which was kind of cool as well. That suggests that, potentially grazing can be done in tandem with these early restoration interventions, but this would also look really different if it was a longer term grazing treatment. And then interestingly, we found that across the board, although treatments had mild impacts even with the backdrop of drought, we found that inoculating the soils didn't. And that was surprising to us, but it also kind of made sense because like plants, microbes need water to establish. We think also that a lot of our soil inoculums sort of blew off the plots. And also I will say that these are sort of like these early results from our project and that the project is ongoing. So it is possible that some of these microbes or these treatment effects will show up if there is a wetter year, although this year is looking pretty bad. So all to say, like across these different networks, we're being highly responsive to people's input. We're being very iterative and trying to learn how things work at small scales. And of course, this is hugely depressing and difficult and challenging sometimes, right? When we're doing like these really intense restoration interventions and trying to learn about what works. And ultimately, sometimes it's really dry and just nothing works. And that's a lot of the work that we're doing with extension and through our STEERS project is really like that piece of communication and trying to figure out messages of hope through time. So the last thing I want to leave you with is sort of like a piece of hope and a future direction in the lab that I'm really excited about that I think addresses like crazy amounts of climate change, crazy backdrops of land degradation and challenges, socio-political barriers, all the like, but ways that we can potentially harness change and their upsides to maybe improve this process as well. So collaboration is key. Even small gains of increasing seedling species recruitment is really important in dryland ecosystems. So that's kind of the message from our collaborative restoration work, but there might be other ways that we can sort of leverage the system to also work together. What I'll talk about today is just this idea that across drylands, especially so millions of acres of dryland ecosystems in the Western United States alone have been slated for solar development. So with a lot of like sustainable energy goals, this has slowed a little bit under the current administration, but still these projects of mass development in drylands are ongoing. And this includes actually a really large solar project with the Ute Mountain Ute tribe that spans many acres and will produce many gigawatts of energy for the tribe over time. So the Sun Bear $1 billion project that the tribe is working on. So local relevance. However, installation of these PV systems involves land degradation, including disturbance of plants, soils, biocrust communities, and it's often pretty dire and can look something like this when the systems are actually being built. However, this is actually a new research direction that's this idea of ecovoltaics has been coined by Alan Knapp's lab out of the biology department. This idea that in most PV systems, there's sort of minimum ecosystem functionality, but we can actually start thinking about ways that we can harness PV development or photovoltaic development to meet ecological goals, which is something I'm really excited about. So this idea that underneath the panels, we're sort of changing temperature, humidity, moisture dynamics underneath these. And we can actually think of them sort of as synthetic nurse plants, which are really important in dryland systems. This is particularly important in systems that are either already degraded or in low stature systems, like a lot of our drylands. So I find it's really particularly interesting to think about how we might leverage solar panels to improve dryland restoration success. And this is something I've been working a lot on with for the planning stage with Mary Van Dyke, who's a postdoc in our lab. But this idea that potentially, like with these microclimates of greater moisture capture and shade and moderation of these harsh environmental conditions in drylands, we might be able to leverage that to promote restoration success. We'll say what's really interesting is I made this beautiful figure showing you what dryland restoration might look like under a solar panel in 42 seconds using Nano Banana on Google. And I wanted, every time you use like image generation or AI to make an image, you're increasing the demand for solar development in drylands. So I did a little bit of that. And that means no one's going to stop. There's like no stopping this. The AI thing is happening. But a lot of what's going to drive this demand for solar energy production in drylands is just this. And it's beautiful and it's scary. But I just wanted to like share that because I had this like mind-blowing moment of like, it all comes full circle. But this idea that with this development across many millions of acres of drylands worldwide, we might be able to harness that for things like improving soil microbial inoculation success and biocrust restoration and plant recruitment. So that's something that our lab group is increasingly working on, and I'm really excited about it. But I'll also say kind of key takeaways from this is that collaborative precision-based restoration, co-producing science with local communities, it ultimately supports better science. It supports actionable science, even when you don't find the things you're looking to find or the solutions you think you want to find at that given moment. Even these stories of low success are important too, and support how people are allocating resources and planning restoration. And so it's all important. And I also think that across this, we found that like precision restoration treatments that manage soil moisture, they are innovative strategies that when timed correctly, we can actually improve outcomes of pretty low success restoration treatments in these really hyper arid and arid systems. And then change is hard. It's ugly. It's like sometimes really hard to see these like huge swaths of like land use change and development and climate change impacting dryland ecosystems and the ecosystems we love. But I also like to think as a scientist about how we might spin some of those changes on their head and think about ways to potentially use them for the betterment of restoration. And the last thing I'll just say is that I think we really need to reflect here and like think really critically about when we do science with communities and for communities, how involved they are in the science that we're doing. And again, ultimately, this idea that the more we work with people across the communities we're working with, the better the science is. So talked way too long. You have like 2 minutes for questions, but I'm excited to hear what your questions are in the next 2 minutes. And if you can't ask me now, you can get in touch with me because you're all friends and neighbors. Thank you. Questions? I just want to go watch Artemis 2, I can tell. Does anyone know if it watched? Anyways, what questions do you have? Yeah.
I guess one thing, very cool talk, first of all. But one thing I'm thinking about when you're like with these precision treatments and you get successful establishment, like once do you think those plants will persist through time, and if they do receive, do you think will the existing plants sort of change the microclimate of those areas, and do you think that will enable better seed success for them?
Yeah, and that's it's always a question of like there's all these different bottlenecks during the restoration process, right? So it's like getting over that like initial recruitment, getting to like an established plant, and then like its longevity through time. I think it's a really interesting question that most research can't look at because of like the limited timescales of most research. I think that that's the benefit of working with a local community, like our work with the tribe, is like we can keep going back and looking. I think that I'm really excited. We didn't get a lot of time to talk about it, but this idea of precision restoration and restoration islands being something that we're looking into with the tribe. We have a new project that we're ramping up there and on the Front Range, but asking that question of like, plant recruitment and propagation is really slow. Like natural recruitment is really slow in drylands. So like if I establish a small microsite of plants, like can it actually nucleate across the landscape? I'm guessing that that process is very slow, right? But it's probably better than nothing. And then, yeah, so I think thinking about that and like, can we layer precision restoration treatments on top of seedling plantings? Or like I think like merging some of like these like really high intensity strategies. And then the other thing, the elephant in the room of all of this, right, is like these things cost a lot of money. And like if we propose that, it's like, can anyone afford to do it? But it's also like the cost of failure is really expensive too. So it's something I think about a lot. And like the middle project that I shared on RestoreNet, one of the things we're doing is working with economists who are actually doing a cost benefit analysis of the restoration treatments themselves. So the money piece, but that goes beyond your question. But I think that we don't really know if like they can self-sustain and reseed. I think a lot of that also depends on, you know, timing and like the long-term drought dynamics and things like that. So you kind of have to get lucky in addition to establishing plants, is my feeling. It's a good question. Yeah, Jake.
I had a question. I'm just curious, sort of building off the restoration island concept. Has anybody thought about using like solar panel installations as restoration islands? Sort of like smaller scale ones?
Yeah.
Maybe be perfect.
Yeah, where that's
like that just kind of like popped into my mind.
Totally.
Maybe it was if they were more dispersed and distributed
yes.
as opposed to just a giant solar installation.
Yeah.
Maybe it could facilitate the restoration of those spaces.
Totally. And I think that that's I got really yucky today, but I think that if I could like talk to you for 2 hours, I would talk to you about some of those ideas, right? Is that, and I think that like in all these solar installations as well, like there are like the areas between panels as well. So they're not like just stacked on each other. So there are like the microsites that are probably going to increase seeded species recruitment or planted species survival. And then there's all these adjacent areas between the panels and like outside the panels that are probably hopefully like to that point like going to be like nucleated into if you get restoration success. And I think that's really interesting to think about. Or not, and you just get an island that maybe can sustain like pollinators to hop from island to island or like can sustain some sort of ecological function. So that was not like that wouldn't be the best case scenario, but I think again like the better than nothing place is somewhere where my brain arrives. But I agree. We know that facilitation and like microsites and nurse plants are critical in drylands. So like why not use like a robotic one is my feeling with the ecovoltaics piece. Yeah. Yeah. There's a fan up here. Can you talk a little